name's Rita McGrath. I'm joined here by Ron Boar, who's going to help moderate and talk through some of the topics we'll be talking about today in this webinar, Seeing Around Corners. Feel free to use the chat function. Ron and I will be monitoring it. Ron probably more than me. This webinar is being recorded, so don't say anything you don't want your boss, girlfriend, mother, or the New York Times to know. We will be monitoring the chat. If we don't get to your questions live in real time, please do put them in anyway, because we'll follow up with you after the webinar. So the topic really is to gather together a community of like-minded folks who are tasked in some way with strategy, innovation, or talent development, and share some of our latest thinking on this topic. Ron is working with me on a program designed to try to create tools. And I know Chris Rangan, who's here too, is also, we're sort of collaborating on a lot of these tools because there's this huge gap between the idea of strategy and what we know works and what can actually be put into place in terms of organizational capability. But I thought I'd begin at the beginning with, where strategy is today and some of the myths that we live with when we're in these worlds of strategy and innovation. And one of the myths is this myth of sustainable competitive advantage. And in fact, I would argue that if you believe in sustainable competitive advantage, it's highly likely to become a trap. And so I thought to get us going, I'd share with you an interview that was done of a CEO who got trapped in that way.
Hey, everybody, say hello to Mr. Jim Balsally. Thanks for being here. How are you? Thank you to be here. Excellent. Good to see you. That's great. Wow. How is it that you have the same one that I have? Shouldn't you have some fancy James Bond version?
You're living the dream, man.
Is that what that is? It doesn't even have a camera. You don't have the camera one. How are things going?
Things are really good, thanks. Yeah, excellent.
You should imagine, all the things that have sort of changed in your life in the last 10 or 15 years.
A lot less has changed than you would think, really. A very normal life, kind of. It's just a whole lot more zeros on everything.
Yeah. Which is great if the decimal point's in the right place, where RIM has gone in the last, did you have a moment where you thought, okay, I think we've reached, we're here?
Not a lot, really. I don't sort of think that way. I don't sort of look up too much. I don't look down too much. It's the great fun is doing what you do every day. And I'm sort of a poster child for not sort of doing anything but what we do, every day. So, no, I don't really think about it a lot, no.
Do you get the sense that at this point, with what the BlackBerry itself, that device has done for your company, that it's a matter of time before other people, the iPhone didn't really do it. Do you ever look at it and go, what are we going to do if this isn't our primary business, growing RIM beyond something like a BlackBerry?
No. Probably die.
That'll just be it.
We're a very poorly diversified portfolio. It's
on one thing.
It either goes to the moon or it crashes to Earth. So, but it's making it to the moon pretty good. So
sure, totally.
We'll stay with it.
And there we have it, folks, the trap of competitive advantages that may not last for very long. So I think the first challenge is that competitive advantage today is really getting compressed. And one of the big issues that I think strategists need to think about is how do we deal with the entire life cycle of a competitive advantage? So the innovation process where new advantages come from, and hopefully those turn into the exploitation process where you get to enjoy the fruits of having created an advantage. But then, advantages drop off. And this is an illustration from the gaming business, where in the beginning, what you had were arcade games. And that's really all there was. And you had to go to a physical place and play a game on a thing that was analog, right? It was a physical thing where the intelligence of the game and the actual game were the same. So the next big revolution in gaming, some of us will be old enough to remember this, was games on cassette tapes, right? And then we had games in different form factors, games that you could take home, games that you could play with, that you could play. And the great thing about that was that, you saw this evolution of the form factors. And of course, today we have games that you play with those virtual reality headsets where you sit on your head. You have games that can be played on mobile phones, games that can be played in virtual reality. What matters here is the pattern, right? That what you see is this innovation where the thing ramps up, begins to hold its own for a while, and then things change. Technology changes, customer needs change, the reality of what's going on changes, and that can create the need to develop a new competitive anticipation. So what we're really seeing is innovation at the beginning of a new competitive advantage, and this need for transformation as a competitive advantage begins to erode are now becoming really front and center to what should be on the mind of those of us studying strategy. And together with that, I think, is a real shift in how we think about our competitive set. I call this competing in arenas. And if, those of us who studied traditional strategy for many years will remember that traditionally in strategy, you found an attractive position in an attractive industry, and you threw up entry barriers like crazy. And the goal was to remain, in that position for a long time. I think we need to start thinking very differently about who our competition really is. So let's take what's likely to happen as we come through this pandemic. And one of the things that we're likely to see is an absolute cascade of weddings. Why? Weddings have been deferred or downsized, venues haven't been available. And so now your 20-something to 30-something population of potential customers is suddenly going to find they're out for outfits and travel and wedding gifts and, you name it. And anything else they might be wanting to buy is going to probably be taking a back seat. So that's something you can anticipate. But, let's say you're in selling computers or gadgets or phones, right? You're probably not even seeing weddings on your radar as a source of competition. So all of this suggests to me that we really need a new playbook for thinking about strategy. So if you can do the next slide. And it has these discrete elements of what's different today than what we may have thought in the past. So I think in the past, we thought of stability as the normal thing. And the way we talked about it was punctuated equilibrium, right? So you had this long period where things stayed stable. Then something changed. You had a period of disruption, and then another long period of things being relatively stable. Well, what we're seeing today is a real priority on the ability of firms to move around, to be constantly in motion, not necessarily dramatic, big wrenching motion, but in motion. And the way to think about that is if you need to get up to pace on an entity or on a task, right? You'll find it easier to do that if you go from a moving position than from a standing start. In my book, I call this continuous reconfiguration, which gives you a clue about how great I am at marketing, because the word agility has now come to mean that exact thing. So how do I keep in sync with my environment and move quickly as I go through it? The next thing that's really different is in conventional strategy texts, we may talk about divestment, but we don't spend a lot of time on the problem of how do I disengage from a business when it's exhausted? And how do I take those resources and move them to where they can be put against the best opportunities? So disengagement happens, but it's painful, it takes way too long. It's very frustrating for the people involved. And I just think we need to get smarter about that. I call that healthy disengagement. Then we have the question of resources. And this really is at the heart and soul of what it takes to compete effectively, today, which is how do you get your best resources up against your best opportunities? And a couple of problems that traditionally have come from this is there's a tendency for resources to get trapped in business units and in places where they were generated. And this idea of being able to move resources, from person A, who maybe had the business that now is being run as a steady state enterprise, and person B who's got a business that's being run for growth, the resources need to go there. How do you make that happen? And big challenge for the strategist. Then innovation, of course, a topic near and dear to my heart. And I think for a lot of companies, we're still dealing with innovation theater, right? We send everybody off to Silicon Valley, or we put up a lab, an accelerator, a startup studio, fill in blank. We fill it full of Post-it notes and creative people running around wearing black t-shirts. And then we sit back and wait for innovation to happen, and nothing happens. And why is that? Because to innovate, you really need 3 pretty robust processes, each of which have a different skill set and a different set of requirements for how they could function, right? So first you need ideation. You need to get great ideas from somewhere. But anybody who does innovation for any length of time will tell you no idea ever sort of survives first contact with a customer. Then you have incubation, where you take that idea and you turn it into something where you can begin to get feedback from the market. You can pilot, you can test, you can get increasing levels of confidence that this is really going to work. And then you have acceleration. And acceleration is the process of taking that thing you've incubated, and now it's got to grow up. You have to pay back organizational debt and technical debt. You have to bring in legal. You have to welcome compliance with open arms. Pretty different challenge than you have in the other preceding phases. So I think we just need to get better about innovation. And the reason is simple. If competitive advantages are shorter, you have to have some process of introducing new competitive advantages, or your organization's going to drift into irrelevance. This has big implications for leadership as well. And the days when you could be a leader and sort of make up your mind about the right thing and tell people what to do, probably not going to work so well, because we're dealing, everybody, all of us, with unprecedented levels of uncertainty. There's just so much we don't know about what the next week, month, year, decade is going to look like, that you need to go from knowing it all, as Carol Dweck says, to learning it all, right? And this was the philosophy that's helped Satya Nadella turn Microsoft around, right? We really want to be curious. We want to be a learning organization. We want to really think differently about how these things work. And lastly, the talent problem. And there's not a person on this call that doesn't have an issue with this, which is great people are scarce, great people are hard to find, great people are increasingly hard to keep. That what we're finding is that really talented people, they'll sign up for a tour of duty with you. So I get this great assignment, I get this opportunity to learn, but unless I see a path to continuing learning and development, as well as the competitive dimensions that I'm thinking about, your careers are like that too. Your careers operate in these waves. And so how do you corral and invigorate the talent that you need when you know that it's probably going to be a tour of duty? It's probably going to be temporary. Okay, next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the next issue, which is how you judge the difference between what you're investing in that supports today's business and what you need to invest in that supports tomorrow's business. And those of you that know my work know I talk a lot about option value. So when I'm in a business, it's pretty predictable and I know what the results are going to be, and I've got a fair amount of confidence about what's going to drive what. I can use things like present value. I can use things like, internal rate of return, or whatever your particular financial metric is. As I move in an uncertain direction, as things become less clear and less predictable, increasingly the value that I'm creating is the value of options, the value of a right to make a future choice. And ideally, a real option is a small investment you're making today that buys you the right, but not the obligation to make a bigger investment down the road. And it's a super intuitive idea. The fact that you're giving up a lunch hour to hang out with us, you didn't get out a slide rule and say, gee, I wonder what's the net present value of the 10 insights I'm going to get about the 3 decisions I'm going to make? No, you didn't do that. You said, something new, a community to talk to. Maybe I'll get some fresh thinking, and that's worth something. And so this really connects very much to the resource allocation challenge. So next slide, please, which is how do you allocate your time and attention and money across different elements of what we call an activity portfolio? How do you get the right resources to the right places so that you can build and maintain for today, but use some of those resources to invest for tomorrow? And so the way that we think about this is you could have uncertainty about markets. You could have uncertainty about the market that you're serving, the ecosystem that you need, the suppliers that you want to work with, or you could have uncertainty about technologies, something that's new. So if you think about your core business, right, those are making today's business better, stronger, healthier than it was before, and that's essential. If you don't get that right, that's going to hamper your ability to pay for anything else. This is the zone in which a lot of transformations take place. I'm going from on-site servers to my services in the cloud, big transition. I'm going through a digital transformation, right? So a lot of that transformation work really takes place in the core. So moving out, next slide, please. Moving out a level of uncertainty, you have investments in new platforms. So these are things that are certain enough, you can put a vigorous push behind them. They are candidates to be the next generation core, but they're not completely baked yet, right? We're still learning and growing. And depending on what the main challenge you're trying to solve for is, they could take a different form. So when Adobe basically said, we're going to take our software and move it to the cloud, and their CEO said, it's got to be better in the cloud than it was on your desktop. Whoa, that's a big technical challenge. You got to get that right. So that would be a platform positioning option. You're taking out a new position in a new frontier. On the other dimension, you have something you've maybe built for yourself or that you already know how to do. And now what you want to do is take it into a new space. So web services, Amazon Web Services very famously got its start because Amazon needed this technology for itself and then had this idea about, wow, maybe other people can need this. So now I have the challenge of I've got to keep my existing infrastructure going, but I've also got to have a piece of my company which is thinking about how I bring that infrastructure outside. So in these two spaces, platforms and core, you really can use your traditional ways of thinking, your present value, the kind of planning techniques that are pretty normal. Once you get to the outer rim here, what you're working on there is options, and the rules change. So a positioning option is a case where I'm pretty sure there's a demand, but I don't know what technology is going to be useful for that demand. So if you think about it, what's going to come after Zoom? Right? Are we going to be holographs? Is it going to be haptic technology where it touches us in some weird form? Is it going to be, beam me up, Scotty? Who knows? But if my business is involved in telepresence in some significant way, I better have some investments there, right? I better be keeping an eye on what's happening in that technological space, what customers are willing to pay for, what experiences we're looking to create. And there's lots of candidates for what could come after Zoom. So the next one. So scouting is different. So a scouting option is a case where I know how to do something. What I don't know is whether anybody wants it, what they'll pay for it, how I get it to them, what packaging it needs. All those things are kind of massively uncertain. And a company that we've worked with a bit is Varo Bank. And Varo is an interesting proposition that its target market is income secure, but cash flow challenged millennials. And as their CEO, Colin Walsh, said, so these are people with money. They've got money coming in the door, but they don't have a lot of wealth yet. So they're one car repair, down payment for an apartment, wedding away from having a cash flow issue. And the existing solution is very expensive. Put it on your credit card and hope for the best, right? So Varo is going to solve this problem. It's a bank all on your mobile phone, and they're going to dedicate themselves to helping people build wealth who are in that category. And the whole thing is going to be made cost effective because it's intermediated by a chatbot named Val. And the question comes up, well, what kind of personality should Val have? If you're going to have a chatbot, right, it's got to have a personality. And the design team pretty quickly broke into two camps. So the first camp was, Val, Val should be like Venmo, right? Hey, dude, tough weekend. Whoa, look what's coming. Don't worry, got your back emoji, thumbs up. Or should Val perhaps be a little more formal? Maybe Val is like, Mr. Robertson, I observed based on my AI-enabled interface that we may be facing some cash flow issues. Here's an alternative I would recommend. Now, in a lot of companies, those kinds of decisions get made by the most important person in the room or the highest power person in the room. And they get all wrapped up in being right? I'm right about this. I know it's Val. I know it's whatever. And here's the thing. You can relax from all that because we don't know. You have the right to say in this kind of high uncertainty space, we don't know. How would we go find out is the mantra instead. So in the case of Varo, how do you figure what out this happens? Well, we got two interns. One of them got to play Hey Dude, and the other one got to play Mr. Robertson. We stuck them in a closet with instructions on how to respond as if they were the chatbot. We lured representatives of our target market segment into the conference room with promises of free pizza, and we let them have at it. And it turns out they hated the Hey Dude guy. Much to the astonishment of many members of this design team, they actually wanted a responsible grown-up when it comes to building your wealth, adding to your money. So I think that's an interesting example of a couple of principles here in option space. The Hey Dude people didn't fail. They just had a hypothesis which turned out not to be supported. So you can't use that kind of being right and failing and all that mindset in this option space because it's not going to get you to the right answer. Okay, next slide. So the last quadrant here is what we call stepping stone options. And this is a case where I don't know how to do it, and I don't know if anybody wants it, but I think the long run opportunity is irresistible. And what you want to do there is find an early market which can seed the commercialization of something that's really new to you. So a great example here is in autonomous vehicles. And I love this category because, if you listen to some people, we're going to have the Jetsons tomorrow. This thing's going to fly up to our bedroom window, pick us up, take us off to our jobs. And it's all going to be here right now because we're telling ourselves the technology is really good. Well, that's right. The technology is actually pretty astonishingly good. It's amazing. But here's the thing. To build an actual venture that's going to be successful, you need a lot more than just the technology. You need the whole supporting ecosystem around it. You need an ownership regime. You need a risk regime. What do you do if everybody wants the autonomous car at the same time? Who owns these things, right? Who's going to make money on them? All these huge unanswered questions. And you're not going to get this category to take off until you got some answers. So where do you start? Do you just give up? No, you start with what I call a stepping stone strategy. And what that means is you find a market that has a real need that can be solved with the technology and the ecosystem that you already have. And one place this is happening in autonomous vehicles is with the military. And they have a big problem. They need to supply frontline troops, and the robots just aren't smart enough to do that yet. And so what they figured out is you can get the robots to play follow the leader. So you put two human beings in a front car, and then you string a string of 6 or 7 supply vehicles behind them. And now you've got a solution that the military can say, this really works. I'm saving 12 people from being in harm's way. I can now use the robots to do things human beings can't do. And it's a solution that really works, and it exists right now today. Now, that's not your big ultimate autonomous market, but it's a stepping stone, and you can make a lot of money from a stepping stone. You can think of it as a series of niches. So that's the basic model, basic framework, what these things do for you. So next slide, please. So the question comes down to, well, how many of what should I have, right? And that is a very strategic question, as we will see. So I learned this with an interaction I had with a manufacturer of medical devices and glamorous products, right? So incontinence treatments and catheters and stents and, just all that kind of thing. I met the CEO, and he, first day upon meeting me, he kind of puts his arm around my shoulders, says, "Darling, if you live long enough, you will need our stuff." I was like, fantastic. I can hardly wait. Anyway, his strategy basically came down to customer responsiveness and speed to market. And if you're in medical devices, a lot of your customers are hospitals and big healthcare practices and stuff like that. And so what would you expect if you had a strategy like that? Well, you'd expect a whole mountain of stuff in the core area, a few well-considered platforms for future growth, and then maybe a few options, right? But if you go to the next slide, you'll see what we found when we did an investigation of this thing. What we found was a mountain of stuff in this expensive, high commitment platform launch area, what some people think of as Horizon 2 ventures, a pile of stuff there, and not very much in the way of options, not very much in the way of the core, which was astonishing, because if you think about it, that strategy is a core business foundation strategy. And what we realized was that what happened in this company happens in a lot of companies, that there was a fundamental disconnect between things that need to work together. And if you look at the next slide, what you'll see is strategy. When strategy is done right, it's pulling you into the future, right? It's a point of view about what is to come and how we're going to prepare ourselves to cope with that. Then you've got budgets. Well, where does this year's budget start? Well, all too often it starts with last year's budget, right? And so budgets tend to anchor you in the past. So you have to get those things working together. Then you have the process by which projects get selected and acted upon. And a lot of times those people have absolutely nothing to do with the strategy people or the budget people. In the case of this medical device manufacturer, what happened was the people who were powerful all wanted to be in charge of the next generation platform. They all wanted to grow these big things and be the person at the top when it sort of charged onto the market. And so the political pressure was pushing people to support these platforms. And then, of course, we have people. And all too often, what we're incenting people on was like 4 strategies ago. And we haven't gone back and redone the comp plan, and we haven't gone back and redone what people are incented by. And so you have this real disconnect, and I see it all the time. So what do we do in terms of taking action on this? And I'll just go through pretty quickly a 5-step process that I can suggest. And then I'm going to stop talking, and we'll take the screen share down, and we'll have some time for open discussion and lots of questions. So 5 steps. Do an inventory. Go figure out what's in there. Second, revisit your strategy. Post-COVID, post-inflection points, there's a lot of stuff going on in the world that maybe should cause you to revisit your strategy. Create some screening statements. So take your strategy and try to translate it into something that anybody in the company, no matter where they work, could actually use to think about whether something fits or not. As part of that, you're probably going to find some opportunities for disengagement, stopping things that maybe in a light of view you never should have started to begin with. And with the resources you free up, how do you explore new opportunities? And then I recommend using discovery-driven practices to plan to learn about those things. Okay, next slide. So first thing you do is you create a portfolio inventory, and we're going to give you the opportunity to download the questions that we use to place projects on them. And so what you're going to do is just get a picture of what you got. And by the way, this particular one looks like a lot of portfolios we've been looking at, where a lot of things that were in that lower left, more stable space have now kind of moved into higher uncertainty because markets have changed and we don't know what to expect. Okay, next one. So then what we do is we use, either hand, which we've distributed to you, or if you have a spreadsheet or a computer system to map these projects. So you answer a bunch of questions and they give you the dimensions on each of the pictures, which allows you to map them. And if you look at the next slide, what that then can do is give you a picture of your portfolio. So a portfolio dashboard. And in this case, it's a pretty simple one. Each of these dots is a project. We haven't yet programmed the part that makes the bubbles different sizes and stuff, but that's coming. So first of all, step one, just get a sense of what you got. Step two, let's take a look at our strategy. So the next slide. So I use as an example Dyson, which I find a fascinating company. So you all know Dyson. These are the people that bring you $200 hair dryers and $700 vacuum cleaners. Basically, if it sucks or blows or uses a battery, they'll look at it, right? And back in 2016, Dyson made the decision to get into the electric car business. They were going to redesign an electric car right from the ground up because it was going to run on batteries. And this was part of their core business. This is going to be great. Now, the thing to know about Dyson is that they are a very high margin company. And the reason they insist on high margins for anything they get into is they will invest years of R&D and years of engineering on something that may not prove fruition yet. And, Dyson himself was reported to have spent over 4,000 different attempts to get a bagless vacuum cleaner. That was his first iconic product, this bagless vacuum cleaner. So if you look at the next slide, what that'll show you is if you were to take their strategy, right? So very high margin, sucks, blows, uses batteries, something that would produce kind of really great returns. These might be some conceivable planks of that strategy. So what's the size of the problem? It's got to be a big problem, right? Vacuum cleaners, sure, huge potential problem felt by a global population. That gets the top score because everybody at some stage needs to clean their floors. It might be okay if it was a huge potential problem, but not globally universal. So things like hair dryers and hair curlers and stuff. Well, it's a lot of the male population of the world that would have absolutely no use for that particular set of products. But it would still be big enough. There's the rest of us that do use those things where we could benefit from them. And if it's a limited problem that only affects a few people, we'll probably pass. So another dimension might be the potential for profitability. If it earns a big premium, that's good. That's a score of top score. If it earns a premium sort of in the meh range, well, not so good. And if it's got low margins or whatever, we're just not interested. So what you do is you take your strategy, your lofty strategy statement, your central integrated concept of how you're going to achieve your objectives. That's how I define it. And you're going to turn it into scorecards so that anybody in the company can evaluate an opportunity and see whether it fits or not. So now you go back to your portfolio and you say, okay, let's look at each of these things that are on our scoreboard and rank order them. And what you're going to get is a series of tiers, right? Best to lowest. And let's say your perfect score is 100. You're never going to get a project that's a perfect 100, never. What you'll get is projects that are varying degrees of good. And if you don't do something like this pretty regularly, the ones at the bottom of the score kind of stack up. So this now gives you, if you look at the next slide, the opportunity to think about maybe we should disengage from some of these. Maybe we should stop doing some of these things. So we're going to disengage from lower priority programs. So that frees up resources to identify new opportunities. Now let's go back to Dyson for just a sec. So Dyson gets into the electric car business, lots of hype, sets up this whole research and manufacturing facility in England. And this is amazing and this is awesome. And then we get to 2019 and everybody and their brother from Volkswagen to General Motors to whatever announces they're going into the electric car business. Now, that doesn't bother James Dyson. He's used to very competitive markets. I mean, appliances and things he makes are very competitive markets, but he always has this technological edge. But here's the problem. Those competitors are going to price that Dyson that electric vehicle at the same price as internal combustion engine vehicles. That's a problem, because if I go back to his strategic scorecards, right, if I can't earn like really fat margins on the sales of every one of these things, it's not for me. So what does he do? He decides to drop the electric car business in 2019 because everybody else had announced they were getting into it. So he made a really, really tough disengagement decision. And this is the kind of thought process that you have to have if you're going to be pretty ruthless about your portfolio. But he thinks there's a huge opportunity in batteries, because if all these other manufacturers are going into electric cars, guess what? They're all going to need batteries. So maybe he can sell ammunition to the combatants and let them knock themselves out making the car. He can just make this very high value added component of it. And so that's what he's doing now. But it's revisiting that strategy and looking at what the new opportunities could look like. Okay, next one. So the way to think about this is to allow your investment capital to increase as you are bringing down the variability of the range of assumptions that you have to make. And so this is something I call discovery-driven planning, where your job is really to convert the assumptions that you're making in the early stages of a business to knowledge about how this business could actually work. And you can see those two relationships. So as your assumptions get stronger and stronger, but as you get more and more knowledge, you can allow investment to increase with higher levels of confidence. So that's the process in a nutshell. And I think it's kind of useful for thinking through how you manage each of these assumptions. So let's show you, if you can do the next one, Ron. So what you get is this assumption checklist. And it has a list of possible checkpoints, and we can send you some material about how you think about checkpoints. And what you can do is you can put a cost on each checkpoint. So when your finance function wants to know, well, you spent $50,000 on customer interviews, what did you learn? You can actually tell them now. So if you go to the next slide, what we do is we capture information about each of these checkpoints. We've got notes that you can do. And so now you can go back to your CFO and say, well, we spent 50 grand to explore the opportunity for this thing with government. And we've opened up a whole vector of new opportunities. Now, remember, small investment today buys us the right, but not the obligation to make a bigger investment down the road. And so the new thing, what we're working on right now, if you go to the next slide, working on right now is an education component to this, which says, okay, I'm at this checkpoint. Let's understand something about what our customer segments are. And what I can do now is at that moment when I need to understand this, click over to the learning site. And now what we can see is a mini course on, what does it look like to learn about customer segmentation. We have 3 lessons, some videos, some downloadable material. And so you can toggle back and forth between, okay, I'm doing the work of this checkpoint. How can I learn effectively what it takes to do that? So that's something we're working on right now. I'm super excited about it. Okay, next slide. So in terms of the premise of this webinar, I think a couple of things that are worth remembering are, we used to think of strategy and innovation as really different. Like when I started in the field, all the cool kids were doing industry analysis and M&A calculations and order of entry dynamics and aggressiveness of market entry and stuff like that. And they were studying outsides of firms, like how did firms behave in industries? It was the way research was done in those days. And those of us studying innovation who were interested in insides of firms and how people make decisions and what strategies go right and wrong, we were sort of huddled in a corner for warmth. And what's happened to the field, I think, in between is those two things have now really come together. So it's very difficult to talk about your strategy, without also thinking about where's your next strategy and your next strategy, and that pulls in innovation. And then, digital. I mean, anytime you're talking about innovation these days, we're really talking about digital. So if we go to the next one. So some things to remember. I think the first thing that is important to recall is if we're thinking about advantages that are transient, advantages that don't last forever, it calls for new skills, right? We need to get better at innovation. We need to get better at transformation. And that never used to be really on the plate of the strategist. The next issue is that inflection points, these kinds of things that create these changes, they don't happen overnight. And as the old Hemingway line says, one character asked another, how did you go bankrupt? And the answer was, well, gradually, and then suddenly. And so too with these shifts in strategy. I think if you're paying attention, if you pick up the early warnings, you can really figure them out pretty quickly. I do think we need to think about competing more in arenas rather than competing in terms of industries. That, your most significant competitor probably comes from some other industry. And if we just confine ourselves to industry analysis and industry associations and industry gatherings, we're never going to, get to the right answer. I think we really do need to pay attention to portfolios. I think we really need to think about getting out to the edges of the organization. And what you really want is to be really thinking about these new opportunities that strategy kind of brings you. So with that, I think we can wrap up our formal remarks, and let's do some questions.
The first question, I got a question here is, Rita, would it be right to think instead of technology uncertainty in resource uncertainty in order to have a broader approach? So technology uncertainty versus resource uncertainty thinking.
Well, I think you could have either, right? So anytime you've got something new that you're trying to do, so let's just take a very concrete example of Zoom, right? So when the pandemic hit, many of us had to head home and try to do our work this way. We had to learn a whole new set of tricks from a technology point of view. But if you think about it through the lens of the guys over at Zoom, they had to suddenly face the fact that they were being asked to scale at a pace that was just really, really, it's hard for us to imagine how challenging that must have been to move forward like that. But also they were in this interesting situation where now they were kind of a public health company, and a lot of schools, universities, a lot of people that needed this communication capability but couldn't afford to pay for it were now using their service. So if you think about it, that's a real market problem. Like what is the market? How are we going to pay for all this? And at the same time, you've got this technological problem. How do we scale this thing to where it needs to be in order to service the needs of our customers? So I think you can have either.
So the next question was please expand on screening statements.
So screening statements came about because what I find, and I don't know about you guys, but I find you think you've been clear about your strategy. You've repeated the thing 100 times. You've told everybody what it is and so forth. And yet, I read a great phrase the other day. It says, and yet the bunnies, they jump out of the box. They take on different things. And so how do you keep everybody in the same box? And what I found works really well is a set of sort of 12 to 15, I wouldn't go overboard, screening statements that have a very skewed scoring system. So the best score is maybe a 9. And so if it really, shakes it out of the park on that particular dimension, it gets a 9. If it's sort of okay on that dimension, it gets a 3. And if it's sort of, doesn't do it for us, or it's a negative, it gets a 1 or even a negative score, something is really negative. Now you can do this, by the way, as a person, you can do this for a division, you can do this for a company, but it basically forces you to simplify. It forces you to say, I've got this lofty strategy about being all things to all people. Well, what does all mean? Is all, everybody on the planet has it? Okay, score of 9. Only one continent has it, maybe score of 3. Only people that live on my block in Princeton Junction have it, that gets a 1 or a negative, right? And so you take that strategy statement or that strategy concept and really try to break it down so that anybody in the company could look at it and go, yeah, got it. And then what you can do is you can compare. And as I said at the outset, there's never a perfect score, never. So let's say you're Dyson, right? And it hits perfect scores on margin and size of business and everything else, but technology doesn't exist yet, and it might take us 5 years to get there. That's a negative, right? So something where technology already exists and we know how to do it probably gets the top score. Technology still has to be invented. Well, that would be a negative score, but it might be a really attractive opportunity. So you might decide to go ahead, but now what you're realizing is here's where it fits and here's where it doesn't. And that's, I think, one of the critical things that a lot of people get wrong when they're trying to translate strategy into decision-making.
Thank you, Rita. Next question is how do you look at strategy? Is it an ongoing journey? If so, how do you communicate it to all employees?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, the pace of your strategy cadence is to some extent going to be a function of how asset embedded your sector is, what you're doing. So one of my more interesting clients is people that finance people that grow trees. And who knew there was such a thing? But there's apparently an association associated with this group for people that grow trees. Well, growing trees is a 40-year endeavor, right? So, that's going to take a bit of adjusting if you're operating with 40-year product cycles, as it were, versus something like, a cell phone or something where you can practically measure the strategic rhythm in minutes. A good general rule is you want to do a deep dive on your strategy probably once every 2 to 3 years for a 2 to 3 year horizon. That seems to work for people, with maybe refreshes in between so that you don't get surprised, along the way. And the way that we think about strategy is there's a period of time where you're getting insights. So I call it 5 C's. What's happening with your customers, your competitors, your complementary relationships. So who else do you need in your ecosystem? Your own company and its capabilities, and the greater context, what's going on. And so you look at each of those areas and say, well, what's changing? What's happening? What do I need to be paying attention to? That's going to throw up a bunch of insights. Then the next thing you need to do is get your senior folks together to agree on what those insights imply, right? And get them aligned. How fast do we want to move? With what degree of vigor? How much risk are we prepared to take on? And then that translates into specific strategic choices. And the way I think about strategy is, what's its purpose, right? Strategy exists to help you make the best choices under conditions of resource scarcity and competition. If you have unlimited resources and no competition, for goodness sake, try everything and just see what sticks. Some of the best regarded tech companies, for instance, I won't name any names, but a lot of them basically have no competition and virtually unlimited resources, and they're doing crazy stuff, which is not really taking them anywhere. We can have a conversation about that later. Okay, so you make your choices, then you flow into how you align the organization. And we've got some frameworks for thinking about that, but the metaphor I like to use is flying a kite. So if you're a leader of a company, right, you can yell at your kite, you can stomp your feet, you can give it incentives, you can punish it. It's just going to lie there if you don't build it right. And so you have to get it in balance. You have to get it in the right conditions, which you can think of as the wind or the lift. And then the way you lead it is with the string, right? You can't force it to do anything, and you can't go jerking on the string, because that's going to be a real deterrent to the organization's ability to smoothly go anywhere. And then the last piece is this portfolio piece, which is, how do I now make the investments I want to make for today, think about what's coming next. And so you can think of going through that cycle in between your big strategy deep dives as kind of a mini review. So maybe once every quarter, once a month, just kind of touch base on each of those points. So what are any new insights I need to have? Are we still aligned as a senior team? Have I stuck to my choices? Have I taken my strategy and translated into specific choices? Do I have the organization I need to execute it? And am I keeping my finger on the pulse of that portfolio? And it kind of goes maybe quarterly as a review of those things.
Very good. Next question is from Christina. What sort of skills, methods, and tools should managers/project leaders have or should focus on to support more innovative strategies within their teams and business units?
Wow.
Love this question.
It's a fabulous question.
Yeah.
How much time have we got, Ron?
Yeah, it's like, what do I really do?
Well, I think where I would start is thinking about those 3 phases of innovation that I mentioned. So there's going to be a phase where your skill set needs to be people who are really good at, taking blank pieces of paper and filling them in, or working within a set of constraints and coming up with alternative solutions, generating a lot of options. That's what you want in that ideation kind of space. In the incubation space, you need design thinking. You need people who are able to really look at how customers interacting, say, with a product or a service, and say, where are they working around? What are they really looking for from us? So a great way of framing that is in terms of jobs to be done for customers. And the skill set there is deep observation, design thinking, and that sort of thing. Now, acceleration, that's a different thing, right? And I'm here to tell you, you probably do not want your wonderful blank sheet of paper. Think of what the world would look like if we were all, haptically connected. You don't want them designing your supply chain. And Ron, this is your area of expertise. Do you want those people mucking around with, how the shop's organized and what the warehouse is doing?
Yeah,
I don't think so.
Much. You might want a process person on that.
So you're going to need somebody who understands operations, who understands how you scale things, who understands how you invite legal in without everybody on your team hating you. And one of the tricky things is the skills are different. And as a project goes through those different phases, you may need different people. Now, sometimes you get 1 or 2 like all-purpose Renaissance geniuses who are really good at each of those phases, or good at finding people who are good at those phases. Usually it implies a different team or a different skill set. To the question on structuring for innovation, and Safi Bahcall, who wrote the wonderful book Loonshots, and I talk about this all the time, and his position is, you know how your culture eats strategy for lunch? He says, yeah, but structure eats culture for breakfast. And what he means by that is the way you structure incentives, relationships among people, ideas about how you get ahead, ideas about what's important, the way you structurally reinforce those, it's what's going to build you a lasting innovative capability or not, as the case may be. It's a great question. I mean, that's one, you could write a whole book on that one.
We could like the next one too. In such a fast-paced environment, any thoughts on how boards can add value on strategy that is versus the executive team? So boards versus the executive team, how do they add value?
Great question. And I think the role of boards is changing dramatically in a slow way, like under our noses, but it's not being talked about a lot because people are really looking to boards to A, hold managers accountable, hold their executive teams accountable, but B, to really be that voice of the future and voice from the future. So a couple of ideas for boards. First thing is diversity of thought. You know, we're now starting to realize that if you have a board that's comprised entirely of the same sort of cookie cutter person, you know, white male, went to a certain set of schools, had a certain set of job experiences, retired as CEO, and now they're on boards, you know, that's fine. And there's nothing wrong with that background, but they're unlikely to have a diverse reaction to your ideas. And they're unlikely to have a diverse response to the things that you're doing. So you really do want to see more diversity on boards. And I know it's something a lot of boards are struggling with, but there's a very fundamental strategic reason. It's because you have these blind spots. So I'll give you an example that a friend of mine, Charles Travail, who's the CEO of a company called Interbrand, used as an example of these kinds of blind spots. He says, well, you know, we were working with British Air and they had this idea about how do we make the flying experience better? And one of their board members said, you know, I've got it. Why don't we, instead of waking everybody up, you know, an hour or two before landing, why don't we offer this sumptuous breakfast buffet when you get to the other end so that you can stretch out on your lie flat bed and get maximum amount of sleep, and this is going to be amazing. And so they thought, that's a really interesting idea. Would that be differentiated? And they went and took it to a bunch of potential customers, and one of the responses they got set them back on their heels, and the response was, that's an idea that's only going to work for the people at the front of the plane. And the question was, well, why? And they said, because in the back of the plane, you're sitting there all night long. You're tired, you're crabby, you're bored to tears. And this was back in the day before you had all this fancy, you know, entertainment stuff. And that breakfast in the morning, like the fact that somebody's going to come and pour you a cup of tea, and maybe there's like a breakfast sandwich, you're looking forward to that is the only thing that's going to break up your monotony. You take that away, we're going to be miserable. Now, I'm not saying the idea was a bad idea, but clearly this person did not have the diversity of experience that all of the customers riding that airplane would expect. And so I think, to come back to the role of boards, I think what would benefit executive teams if boards can be trusted confidants rather than enemies, if you can have a space of psychological safety so a board member could raise an issue that maybe management hadn't thought about. And if you can have boards that are able to provide valuable input, not because they're telling anybody what to do, but because they're offering a distinctive point of view. And that's when a board's at its best.
Yep. So from David, walking in the shoes of a potential buyer in this new environment, what's changed in decision-making? How offerings is received? What is the new filter/bias?
From looking at customers?
From a buyer's perspective.
So I think a couple of things that are worth bearing in mind. So the first thing that's worth bearing in mind is customers, buyers, expect from you the best experience they've got from any provider in any industry. So I was with a medical devices company, I think it was Philips, and they had this diagnostic device which went under people's skin, and it showed you the results on this like green, you know the one that went to be like green with a monochrome screen, like, and the technology behind this was absolutely unbelievable. The diagnostic thing that they could do was remarkable, never been done before in the history of mankind. And so they were showing it to some prospective users, and the users kind of looked at it and said, well, why can't that thing look like an iPhone? You know, that ugly green thing that's giving you the medical readout. Why can't that look like an iPhone? So the first thing to remember is customers are going to expect the best of whatever they've experienced anywhere from you. So that's really important. I think the second thing is customers expect to be part of relationships these days rather than transactions. And I think digital has really made that a reality. So if I'm buying a hammer, I expect to be able to interact with all the other people that bought that hammer. I might have a community of interest around that hammer. There may be an entire second life about recommendations to the manufacturer about the next batch of hammers. So we're seeing much more of a continuous flow of exchange rather than this sort of one-time kind of transactional, I buy a hammer to fix this thing and then it sits in my garage and I'm done. And so I think there's the expectation, the nature of relationship. And I think a third thing has to do with trust. I think buyers are much more suspicious perhaps than they might have been at one point. And building trust is increasingly something I see companies worrying about, that they, if you're perceived as untrustworthy, that can destroy your brand overnight.
Let me see. From Alessandra, medium-sized companies seems to be still resilient to disruptive innovation, are more comfortable with incremental innovation, which does not, however, actually differentiate so much their value proposition. What is your recommendation on that? So the question is incremental innovation versus more challenge versus being challenged by disruptive innovators. How does a mid-sized company compete?
Yeah. And Ron, I'm going to call on you two to think about this. And the case I'm thinking of is a project the two of us did with a regional bank.
Yeah.
And I think when a mid-sized company gets it right, they are the partner to their customers on things that a large global company can't do, and that a little bitty startup doesn't have the scale to be able to accomplish. So maybe, Ron, if you could tell that story briefly.
Yeah, I could talk about that. So at the beginning of the what Rita would call the aftertime, the pandemic, in April, May of last year, a lot of you may know there was this program called PPP, Payroll Protection Program. And simultaneous with that all happening, we were engaged with a regional bank to help them, understand their, customer, help their leadership team better think about their value proposition and customer engagement. And so we spent a little bit of time with the bank and really working through the consumption change primarily with the bank. So all of the points at which they touch a customer, and even more importantly, the gaps between those points. So those kind of disengagement points. As a little bit of a backstory, I'm friends with the CEO of the bank. And I think it was the Saturday before the whole world shut down. He and I were having a drink, and I said, you realize that something like half of your customers can go bankrupt in the next 6 months if this pandemic is as bad as people think it is. And he kind of turned very pale, and our conversation led to more drinks, but that led to the engagement. And one of the challenges this bank had, they're kind of famous for having good customer relationships, but not great technology. So they actually didn't have an interface with the Small Business Administration to process PPP loans. So here they had hundreds and hundreds of customers that needed this money desperately. And the big banks, and I mean Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, those banks were not talking to small customers. They were going to, if you recall, early in the pandemic, they were going to their very large customers and writing these large PPP loans. Many of those customers actually gave the money back due to political and other pressures. So the bank really had to work. They discovered this as a major friction point, and this kind of became a rallying cry for them. And they literally worked 24/7, 7 days a week to establish a direct interface with the Small Business Administration, create teams that would proactively reach out to their customers. And at a time when small businesses couldn't get loans, they were approving 99% of the customers that they processed SBA loans for. And quite the opposite from their losing customers. Their portfolio in the last year has actually grown by 30%. So they've gained very large customers. They've made their current customers much more loyal. I'm actually a shareholder in the company. The stock is up about 50% year on year, and it's a small regional bank. So the performance has been stellar. That's really driven by a change in mentality at the bank that actually took an existing culture and took it to the next level. And understanding that they had these major friction points. They never really had to process an SBA loan before because it was never a crisis. So they could take their time, and if it took 2 months to process the loan and the customer got the loan, it was great. Well, there's some great stories about them processing loans at 3 o'clock in the morning, and their clients, breaking down in tears when they actually got the money so they could stay in business. So a great story, and a great example of somebody who, an organization that took the time to look differently at their consumption chain and where the friction points were, and really did something about it. It's really a fantastic story.
It's a great story, and a really well spent engagement too. I mean, it totally changed the way that they went after the bank. So back to the overall theme of what can a mid-sized company do, if you get yourself aligned right, you can actually offer far superior, much more tailored services to a much more select group of customers than a large homogenous player can. And that's the problem with being large, right? You have to have a degree of standardization or you don't get scale. Yeah. And so there's this very, very interesting thought process there.
We're getting up against our time, Rita. I posted the link to the opportunity template in the chat.
Oh, great.
So folks, please click on that. It's a free resource. And I think, Rita, we're going to be following up with some other free resources to the group in the coming days.
Yeah. So, I mean, as I said, we're sort of keen on building a bit of a community because it's very lonely being a strategist or a head of innovation or anything like that. So we thought this would be a great way to get the conversation started. In the coming weeks, we're going to have a thing called a bare bones NPV calculator, which was a concept developed way back when I wrote my book, Discovery Driven Growth, together with Ian McMillan. And it kind of got old and obsolete, and we took it down and we've reimagined it. But now people have said that's really useful to them. So we thought that might be a nice tool to share with the community. And it'll be up next week is when we're hoping to have that up. And, things like that you can actually use and put to work in your strategy in general. And then Ron and I are working on some cool software, which if you'd like to have a look at it, let us know. What it aims at is that piece in between getting great ideas and going into acceleration. So it's really designed to help you manage your way through the incubation process. And it's got a software spine, but it's really about education and building capability. So if that's interesting to you, let us know. Other things to keep in mind, we have the new website, which is VALIZE.com. And there's a section called Deeper Dive, and you can access videos. In fact, I think there's a video of us doing a mock-up of that session with the bank. There's downloadable articles. There's lots of stuff you can find there. So feel free to have a visit. Thank you for spending an hour with us. And Ron, any closing benedictions?
No, I want to say thank you to everyone. Click on the link, and when we have your email from the original sign up, and we'll get those resources to you. And if you click on the link, you'll then be in our kind of Kajab world. And as we come up with free resources and interesting things we think you'd like, we'll send it out to you. We promise not to spam you. We're not going to sell your names. It's not what we do. So thank you very much.
We wouldn't be in business very long if we did that.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your participation. It was our pleasure to be able to do this.
Great.